This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. Each week, we bring you timely interviews with industry experts from pharma, biotech, medical devices, and life science manufacturing, with discussions focused on trending topics, frequently asked questions, and industry best practices. This week, we are pleased to welcome David Nettleton. He's principal with Computer System Validation. Welcome, David. What a pleasure to have you today.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thank you.
Absolutely. I'm excited about this topic as we talk about the 6 most common problems in FDA software validation and verification. So I know
I live through these 6 problems every day.
I know you do. And I'm sure that this is going to be great information for our listeners. As the industry becomes more technologically advanced, working to become fully digitized, implementing Internet of Things strategies, including automation, machine learning, and big data analytics, I should say. We're reminded that increased use of software and computerized systems also means there's an increased risk of exposure. And so I'm sure that's what leads to these 6 big problems that you deal with every day. But before we leap into that, David, before we leap into that, can you explain, what CSV, computerized systems validation, entails and why it is so important in a highly regulated industries?
Yeah, sure. So back in 1997, when 21 CFR Part 11, the Electronic Records and Signature Rule came out, the term software validation meant validation by anyone. It's like the software has to be validated. But it wasn't really sure who had to do it. So around 2005, the FDA said, let's clear this up. We're going to use the term software validation to mean validation by the software vendor. And that is validation for generic use. For any company that buys the software, will the software work?
Right.
From the vendor's perspective. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to work for the specific intended use of that particular company. So one company might use the software differently than another company. So they had this other term called computer system validation. Computer system validation is the validation of a system. A system is the hardware, the software, and the processes specific to the users. So every piece of software gets the first validation by the vendor and then gets computer system validation by each set of users. You could even have multiple users within a company. I have giant corporations that have multiple sites. Each site has to do a separate validation because each site uses the software slightly differently. So computer system validation is really an educating experience where the users learn what the software can do. They learn how to configure the software. They get to figure out which functions they want to use. They want to use the software to do their work, and they want to make sure it works correctly. So prospective validation before you actually do something in production environment, is what the users really want. They really don't have time to do it is their problem, but they really do want to do it.
Sure.
The most important part of computer system validation is maintaining a set of specifications that detail how the system is used, how you set it up. It's not about testing. So many people are trying to buy test scripts from vendors and thinking that it's a lot of test cases, because years ago it was. We used to run literally thousands of test cases, and there'd be binders that were really thick, full of print screens. Though that hasn't happened I haven't seen that happen since about 2005, but
Wow.
People are still doing it today, and that kind of gets people thinking the wrong way, and it makes them afraid of validation. As computers get more advanced and software gets more complex, and systems become more integrated, we need to do better on validation. And so the risk-based approach is the way to go today. The risk-based approach eliminates almost all of that testing, and it gets you to focus, as I said, on the specifications. If you can understand the risks, If the users and managers can understand what their processes have that is risky, they can reduce the regulatory and legal liability because they know if I've got this risk, what I can do to downplay that risk or mitigate the risk, and that makes it better for everybody. So the risk-based approach is definitely the way to go. It's been around since like around 2005 timeframe. I've done like 297 risk-based projects, and I got to tell you, there's no other way to do it other than risk-based. It's the only way to deal with the large size and complexity of modern-day software. And the great thing about computer system validation is that it always pays for itself. A failure, an adulterated product, is so expensive to deal with that it's actually cheaper just to spend the money to validate up front and not have those problems than have to deal with problems.
Right.
So,
less headache.
That's exactly right. So validation really is here to stay. I say it's the skill for the new millennium. It's the skill everyone wants to have. And if you learn to do it efficiently and with low document overhead, I use fill-in-the-blank templates for everything. If you do it correctly, it really works well. But if you do it incorrectly, and so many consultants and people have experiences that are real long-winded. I was just on a phone call with a client right before our podcast, and they told me that they installed one piece of software, 166 pages of documentation.
Wow.
Now, that should have been 2 pages of documentation, not 166.
Yeah.
See,
and it leads you to wonder, David, when you have that much documentation or your process is that lengthy, even in written form, to me, it seems like people are going to try to cut corners. Like, that's just asking for trouble, it sounds like.
Not only do they want to cut corners, they actually want to eliminate the exercise altogether, and they just want to pretend it doesn't exist. So I've got to get them over the hump by just showing them. I'm going to literally walk them through filling out a fill-in-the-blank template for an installation protocol, 2 pages long. It'll probably take about an hour to an hour and a half. And I think their eyes will open up and they'll go, it doesn't have to be that hard.
Right. No, absolutely. So before we move on to the templates, because that's a great idea, I just wanted to talk a little bit about 21 CFR Part 11. So understanding that guidance, the FDA's regulations on electronic records and electronic signatures allows organizations to move to electronic quality records, thereby removing the need for paper-based documentation, but can also be the source of missteps. Can you elaborate on the regulation, A, and B, why it often creates confusion for many companies?
Well, creating confusion is actually what this law did, okay? I actually worked on the committee that wrote the original draft of it, okay? And we wrote a 7-page draft, and when we saw the law in like mid-1997, I promise you not one word we wrote was in it. So the FDA came out with a 2-page law that had nothing in it about what we thought should be in it.
Sure.
So while Part 11 allows a company to use electronic records in place of paper records, and the truth for instead of a blue ink signature, you can have an electronic signature, it doesn't tell you any of the specifics of how to do this in a compliant manner. It's only a 2-page law. It has no detail at all in it. And as a result, Part 11 compliance, even after 20 years, now it's 23 years it's been in place,
right,
it's still relatively low. I find around 40% and going down, okay? Compliance is actually decreasing, okay?
Sure.
Part 11 is only 2 pages long. It's intentionally vague. The lack of information is because both the FDA and industry really didn't know how computer systems would evolve over a long period of time. Now we do. We now know, and evolution's actually pretty small today, but it took decades for us to figure out. I mean, computers were, I remember DOS, and you could only run one program, and now computers are so amazing, okay? We didn't know what we were doing back in 1995 timeframe when the law was being written. But the industry standards evolved, and now we have a really good set of industry standards. So is it time? I mean, this is not, I don't want to get into this discussion today, but perhaps it is time that, they revisit this guidance and give it a little update. I know they've done that with a lot of other guidances industry-wide recently. So Yeah, well, the FDA has issued guidance documents, and a new guidance document is coming out, I heard in September, called computer assurance, I think is the new term, instead of validation.
Assurance, but really Yeah,
computer software assurance is
there it is. Yes.
Computer software assurance. I don't know. It's a new term, and what it's going to say is, I think it's going to say is, use the risk-based approach, which is what I've been saying all along. So I think if you do it correctly, and they're trying to move us in the correct vein here, I think they're going to say use fill-in-the-blank templates, use the risk-based approach. But we don't really know until this guidance comes out. Now remember, that's guidance. The law itself from 1997 has never been changed.
Right.
And they're still not changing the law. Now, Annex 11, the European counterpart, they did change theirs in 2011, and it's a whopping 4 pages long, double the size of Part 11, and it's definitely better.
Right.
So let me just tell you a little bit about what's been happening. The key to understanding Part 11 is not to read Part 11. It's not in Part 11. You can't read it there.
Sure.
The key is to understand that everything you need to know about Part 11 is in the industry standards.
Yes.
Now, what are these industry standards? These industry standards are standards that came about between 1997 and really they're even coming about today, but they really got the most of them in by 2011. So 1997 and 2011, over 100 standards come out. Okay, now these standards.
Before you launch in, David, I just want to point out for listeners so they can follow along, because we did promise them that we were going to give a rundown of the 6 most common issues, right, in software validation and verification. And I can tell you're about to jump in. So I just want to let our listeners know. Number 1, which has to do with required systems. And you're going to go ahead and describe this issue and give us examples for our listeners, I know. So go right ahead. Number 1.
Okay. So one of the first ones is, we know that Part 11 is vague, and you don't know what you do and don't have to validate. Now, not every piece of software has to be validated, okay? So one of the required industry standards is that you have to have an SOP that requires you to maintain a software inventory. This is a list of all the software you've got, and this is whether it has to be validated or not. Now, the internationally accepted GAMP standard, so everyone says, oh, I'm GAMP compliant. GAMP 5 today is the latest one.
Right.
That GAMP standard actually tells us what does and doesn't have to be done. So the good news is that the GAMP standard says that operating systems, word processors, presentation, drawing, internet browsers, email, and non-GXP programs like accounting programs are all exempt from validation. So those are what don't have to be validated. That means we can now focus on what does have to be validated.
Sure.
So if your system has GXP, where GX, the X is a variable for good laboratory practices, good clinical practices, or good manufacturing practices,
right.
In those cases, we're talking about validation. But on the other cases, you don't have to validate. So that significantly reduces the workload for companies.
Okay. So, yep. So as an example, a device manufacturer who chooses not to use all the vendor supplied capabilities of a software then only needs to validate the function. So let's get into that, because there's all of these programs that don't need to be validated, right? But then even under good manufacturing practices, in the case of a device manufacturer, if they're using a particular software that they buy from a vendor, let's say, but they choose not to use all of the capabilities, can you talk about what their responsibilities are in terms of validation and verification of the pieces they are using versus the pieces they're not using?
Right. So let's say there's 100 functions in the software of this particular version.
Right.
And, the functions grow over time as the versions increase, the number of functions increase. But let's say the first version they get has 100 functions and they use 62 functions. They have to validate 62 functions.
Okay.
They don't have to validate the functions they don't use. Now, they do have to configure the software. So there'll be a series of configuration options, and they do have to set every single configuration option. Okay? So even if the configuration option is, I don't use it, okay? But they have to set it to some value. They have to have security, okay? And so they have to set that up. But then when it goes to validating the individual functions, They only have to validate the ones they use. Whereas the vendor who does software validation, they have to validate all 100 functions because they're not sure if you're going to use them or not. So that's a good rule.
Right.
A good rule is you only validate what you use.
Absolutely, especially if you are a manufacturer or an organization, let's say, that's only using a dozen of the functions out of the 100, right? It would not make sense for you to have to go through and, pay attention to all of the other stuff that doesn't pertain to you.
The number one question I get asked is, do I have to validate Excel? Excel has like 10,000 functions in it. And they say, I only use Excel to calculate some, average of something. And I'm like, then you only have to validate that one function, the one you use. You don't have to validate all of Excel. So when you tell people that, they're not as afraid of validation and they're much more willing to do it.
Of course. No, I think that makes a big difference, right? Because it can be very overwhelming, the thought of having to do, take 1,000 different steps or do 100 different things just to use the one function in Excel, let's just say.
Exactly. Exactly. Right.
So, David, moving on to the second then most common error includes software requirements and finding the best fit for your company needs. So as we mentioned, most likely as an organization, you're not going to need all of the functions offered by the software. But how can you talk about finding the best fit for your company and what really can go wrong here in this step?
Well, I mean, you're right at the top of the pyramid here. So the very first step in any validation, I don't care if it's software validation, computer system validation, is always to define your requirements. Now, I think of requirements as a grocery list, okay? It helps me to remember what to buy, okay? Now, Part 11 has only 3 requirements. The little 2-page law says R1, you got to have user security. R2, you have to have an audit trail. Yes. And R3 is you can use electronic signatures if you want them, but you don't have to. But let me tell you, we really want them because now that we're living in a pandemic, you don't want to have to go in the office to sign something, okay? So you've only got 3 requirements, okay? So those requirements are vague, okay? Once you know the requirements, you still don't know what the specifications are. Specifications are very different than requirements.
Of course.
What exactly does a requirement entail? Okay, so let's just say we use milk, for an example. My grocery list says buy milk. That's a requirement. But what does milk mean? Well, in my family, milk means 1% milk, a gallon. It comes from a cow, okay, and it's got a 14-day expiration, okay.
Right.
But my neighbor, they say it's a half a gallon of almond milk.
Okay.
I mean, that's a quite different specification.
Very
but both of our grocery lists, both of our grocery lists have exactly the same requirement: buy milk. But we buy totally different milk. So knowing that a requirement and a specification are different is one of the first things you have to get right. Because if you get that wrong, everything else is going to be wrong. It's the very first step.
Of course.
This is where the industry standards come in. Okay. So currently there are 43 features that you got to have in your software. While we said that it's security and audit trail and e-signature, those 3 become 43 actual functions in the software. Okay?
Amazing.
So that's what you need to go. Let me give you some examples.
Yes, please.
So one of the first security standards is your password length must be a minimum of 8 characters. Okay, that 8 characters is a specification for the requirement security. You must have, after 20 minutes of inactivity, you prompt the user for their password again. Okay, so that's the inactivity timeout feature. Every time you log in, the software should tell you the last time you logged in. Okay, so you know if it was you that logged in the last time or if some criminal got into the system. So those are 3 of the 43 industry standards. If you don't know what the industry standards are, you don't know what kind of software to buy. Okay, Part 11 does not include any of the industry standards. The FDA does not issue a list of the industry standards. You actually have to get the industry standards from industry. Hey, guess what? Your industry, I'm industry. You can get them from us. Like, we can do this. I teach webinars and seminars all the time. I write books, and I tell people the industry standards. both the software vendor and the users need to seek out the standards because they're not readily available from the FDA. And there's all kinds of sources for them. Maybe one day we'll do a webinar together and we'll go over all of the industry standards. But
I think that would be fantastic. Because
there's a comprehensive list and it's really fabulous. You want these features.
Absolutely, absolutely. And a lot of companies haven't explored, all of the different options that are out there. They've done what they've needed to do to keep moving forward. But I think a seminar like that or a webinar like that would be great and provide a lot of missing information.
I totally agree with you.
So, David, so far we've talked about the systems and the software needed, but oftentimes there are many other resources that can be insufficient or inappropriate. You're talking about getting your information from industry. So if you have insufficient information or the wrong information, that can lead to other issues in and of themselves. So can you describe how this poses a problem and kind of, what you do to get around this with your clients?
Yeah. So first of all, the industry standards tell us which software has to be validated. We can use that GAMP standard.
Yeah.
It tells us what functionally needs to be available. Okay. Those are those industry standard features. And it tells us even how to validate. Okay. The problem is we need resources, which are people, to do the work. Now,
okay. Yes.
You need a user representative to stop doing their normal work. So you might have 10 people in a department doing the same thing, but one of those persons has to stop doing their work. The other 9 people are going to do their work for them. And that person has to leave their normal work and go work on a validation team. Okay? So I like to call that a validation vacation. The person is going on vacation from their normal work, but they're going to be doing validation, which is actually harder than their normal work.
Right.
Getting management to structure the organization so that users are continually available to do validation, because you got to do validation for the current version, and then you got to do validation for the upgraded version that happens in a couple months and then a couple months from now. You're constantly going to be in validation, so you got to have people that are constantly available to do that, and it has to be the users. So computers make us much more productive, but there's overhead. It's kind of like a car. You buy a car, it gets you from point A to B really fast, but you got to maintain your car. It continually costs money. You got to put fuel in your car. You got to buy tires, transmission fluid. So there's overhead associated with it. Once you get users to participate on a validation team and train them, they can do this over and over again. So I like to do train the trainer. I train your company to do validation, and then you train the rest of your company to do validation. And it works really well. And it becomes really natural to use. You use fill-in-the-blank templates, so every project is exactly the same. QA reviews every single document, so you have a uniform review process to make sure that you're filling out the templates correctly. It's very repeatable, and this independent review from QA, they are able to change the culture. If they get everyone to do it the same way, everyone's filling out the templates, people are working together better, it changes. I've actually seen my clients go from fighting internally to getting along with each other, saying validation helped them get along because they all understood the same system the same way. And so I'm really happy when my client says, hey, our company runs better because we validated together, and it was like a family kind of orientation, a family visit. We did it together. We like each other now.
And they're really very consistent, right? And the process is very consistent when you're using templates, and the outcome, the end result where you get to is, has a lot of not just consistency, but that everybody's done it the same way and you can rely on it. It's a reliability factor as well.
And that's so important because now you feel confident when you're getting an FDA inspection or when you're getting an audit. Absolutely. And that confidence actually helps you do better in the audit. You're able to defend yourself better. You're able to not be so frustrated by what's happening in these audit processes. And it really does make work more enjoyable for everyone, especially QA, who takes the brunt of that.
Of course. And David, thank you, because templates are a great way to consistently document processes and capture necessary data. And I want to thank you for supplying some of those templates for us. We will, just for our listeners, have a link in our show notes to some of those so that you can take a look. So thank you for that. So moving on to the fourth most common gotcha involves specifications of use and version specific issues. And you started to mention this when you were talking about training someone and they're taking a validation vacation, although I don't think it's really much of a vacation. I'm just going to point it out. But I can imagine that vendor responsibilities, release of software updates, and managing the cloud does impose many variables to CSV teams. And so having this key person is really important. Help us understand that a little bit more, like what kinds of mistakes can happen if you don't have this person in place. I know you talked about the benefits of it, as in you get more consistency and your teams are getting along better. But if that person isn't there or a company isn't doing it this way, what kinds of mistakes have you seen made?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we know that every version of software has to be prospectively validated. That means before production use. And that means you're going to have to validate again and again and again. So it's something you have to be repeated. One issue is getting software validation, the validation by the vendor, confused with computer system validation, the validation by the user. So getting that wrong, you've started off wrong. SaaS, software as a service, has confused it even more because the vendors all say, we validated already. But that means that they've done software validation, not computer system validation. So someone can't do your validation for you, okay? Software vendors try to help us by providing test scripts, but this is an incorrect approach. The vendor will say, I can help you do your user level validation and you can just rerun our test scripts. That is absolutely wrong to do. It's easy, but it's completely wrong. You don't want to test something that they've already tested, and they tested it generically, not specifically. You care about specific intended use, how you're going to use it, and only the functions that you use. But they tested all the functions, and they don't know how you're going to use it. So getting software validation and computer system validation confused, and I would say this is like 70%, 80% of the market gets this confused. And so we definitely don't want to buy test scripts.
Right. Now, you don't need that. You need to just make sure that your system is functioning the way you intend it to for whatever process you're trying to prove. Yes?
Exactly. And you don't have to repeat what the vendor has already done. So we don't want to buy test scripts. We don't want to execute test scripts from the vendor. What we want to do is we want to try to get a handle on the rate of releases. These upgraded versions are happening really, really fast today, and we actually have to slow this down. We want to make sure that we, in our contract with our vendors, say, we really want a realistic release schedule. We want a minor version, a point release, 0.1, 0.2. We want those to be no more than once a quarter, and we want the major releases like the 1.0 going to 2.0. We want the major releases to be no more than once every 3 or 4 years. So if we can limit how fast we're getting the software, then we can get a handle on doing our validation. Validation takes a little while to do, and it changes, how you use the software. It changes your processes. So we can't have too fast of rate.
That makes sense.
Actually, SaaS is about convenience. And I have actually seen compliance go down with SaaS. Software as a service means that our local IT people don't have to install for us, but it also means that the vendor can now install a new version anytime they want.
Right.
And that's causing a big problem in our industry. We're getting software versions so quickly that we don't have time to revalidate. And so if you don't have time to revalidate, then you kind of give up and you don't validate at all, and then you have software that you don't fully understand. I had a vendor tell me just a couple days ago that their goal is to release a new version of software a minimum of once every 2 weeks.
Wow.
Could you imagine every 2 weeks getting a new version of software that you have to validate, and that validation takes you a week? That's crazy.
I was going to say, you can never get on with the business of your business because you'll be spending your entire time validating.
Time in validation, right? Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So one of the things that FDA, now you mentioned at the beginning that one of the 3 requirements is audit trails, right? So traceability, I know, is a huge factor in terms of FDA expectations, as you mentioned. And the ultimate findings are warning letters that result, right? This is what we fear in industry.
Oh, yeah.
So regulatory agencies want to be able to follow the trail throughout the entire product life cycle. What kinds of obstacles have you seen in terms of traceability or lack thereof, shall we say? Because, if you can't keep up with the validation of your systems, then you're certainly falling behind in terms of audit trails, I would think. So can you talk a little bit about that?
You're absolutely right when you talk about traceability. It is one of the, you go after the easy things. And
right.
The easiest thing is to find something that doesn't trace to something else. My dad is an accountant, and he says counting things is easy to do. And he says you should do it first, and you should do it often. Basically,
yes.
You should do it always. So he finds that most of what he audits is, he's got some number here. Is that number somewhere else, and are they the same number? This is how auditors think. They go after what's easy. Requirements have to trace to specifications. Specifications have to trace to risks. Risks have to trace to test cases, and test cases have to trace to test results.
Right.
And the traceability matrix is what they go after. So you do have to have a trace matrix between requirements and specifications. There's no way to line them up. R1 might be S6, but it might be S11. You have no idea. So you're going to have a trace matrix. But here's the great news. That's the only trace matrix you need today, because we've eliminated all of the other traceability matrices. So when you have a specification going to a hazard, it's 1-to-1.
Right.
S1 is H1. S2 is H2. It's 1-to-1. We don't need a matrix. The same thing is true for test cases. Spec 1 goes to test case 1, and spec 2 goes to test case 2. And we can take it even further, go to the result. The result from test case 1 traces to test case 1, traces to spec 1. So we have no traceability matrices for anything other than requirements and specifications, which means you've cut out most of the areas where an auditor can find a failure. So that's the way to do it, direct tracing.
Which sounds great. So why isn't everybody doing it? And what is happening for companies that they have not embraced this yet?
They don't know about the fill-in-the-blank templates. They're doing it old school. I see people today, like I had a client in San Francisco. You know how progressive San Francisco is,
Right.
That's like where Uber comes out of, right? And I'm like, where did you learn validation? He says, well, I learned it from a large pharmaceutical company in South San Francisco. And they taught this person, a young person in his mid-20s, they taught him the most inefficient validation model I've ever heard of. It was decades out of date, but that's the way large companies work. They do things the old, slow way.
Right.
They don't do things the new way. So the fill-in-the-blank templates have been, my first book published on that was like 2005, 2006 timeframe. The
Sure.
risk-based approach was invented in 2004. So between 2004 and today, I've only done the risk-based approach. And I've used the same fill-in-the-blank templates. And here's what's great news. The templates have never changed. The templates from 2004 work today because the templates work. They're a new way of doing things. Validation is a lot smaller, a lot more efficient, and most of all, it makes sense. People used to tell me, David, I don't know why we're validating. It doesn't make any sense. And it's because they were mainly running test scripts that didn't make any sense.
Right. And of course, that wasn't efficient or effective, right?
It was some consultant thought it up to make a lot of billable hours is what happened.
Sure.
And that's the wrong way to do it. So we definitely want to make our users efficient. They got to get back to work. They got to get off vacation and they got to get to work again. And so it's just to tell you just a little statistic. So a typical medium-sized validation project using the fill-in-the-blank templates takes 2 people, 2 users, plus 1 person from IT. So let's say a team of 3, 2 weeks start to finish the first time. That's it. And it's 150 pages. That's the first validation. The second validation takes like 2 days, and it's like 4 pages. So once you're in the small is bigger, validation isn't that hard. And it's very very easy to do it on your validation vacation time and then get back to work. So it's been around for a while, but people don't know it. They don't know the templates are available. They don't know the industry standards are available. And it's primarily because a lot of consultants don't really want to tell you how easy it is.
Right. Well, it's been 16 years, David. So it's time to start working smarter, not harder, right?
I'll give you that.
So that's why we do what we do. And I appreciate you being here today. And this is why we have these conversations weekly, so that we can bring these best practices to light for all of our listeners and everyone in the industry, because it is important that they have this information and that they understand that there are resources like these templates and these trace matrices out there that they can literally fill in the blanks and not spend weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks on this.
Exactly.
Constantly. So thank you. So the final, number 6, the final widespread hiccup for discussion today is one that we see in many regulated companies: the lack of appropriate SOPs, or standard operating procedures. Why do we see this so frequently? And what are some tools or tactics that you can recommend for avoiding this pitfall?
Boy, you are just firing all cylinders today, because you mentioned a 4-letter word, SOPs.
SOPs,
it is amazing. I know. It amazes me. I've been around a long time. It amazes me that the most important part of any quality system, the SOP, is the most troubling in almost every company. I mean, I would say 99% of companies that people hate their SOPs.
Right. I hear this a lot.
Yeah. We hear it, and yet no one does anything about it. We need kind of a revolution. Over the decades, the level of detail in SOPs has changed. So back when I was in my 20s, there was like 3 levels. You had a high-level policy, a medium-level SOP, and a low-level work instruction. And they were never up to date, and people hated them. Today, we only have a medium-level SOPs. We don't have policies. We don't have a work instruction. So the one thing is get current. Only one level of instruction document.
Okay.
All the fill-in-the-blank templates are inside the SOPs today. So that's medium level, okay? The big problem with SOPs is all these required sections. So you read an SOP, and before you ever get to the procedure, you have to go through all these required sections. People tell me that a 5-minute update to the procedure takes half an hour to update all the other sections. So the other sections, like the responsibility sections, the definition section, okay, the scope, all that's taking them more time than the actual procedure that's telling someone to do their work properly. So we need to have SOPs that are written by the people that use them, and they have to be written in a way that the people following them can understand them. I often hear users tell me, I don't follow the SOP. The SOP isn't right. I'm like, then you need to fix the SOP. And they go, oh, it's too hard to fix the SOP. It's too much work. It's too difficult. QA is going to make it difficult for them. So that's the biggest problem. We have to have QA make SOP authoring, review, and approval easy and fast. I say you can update an SOP in 2 days. I've had clients tell me that they cannot update an SOP for 4 months.
That's
2
ridiculous.
days versus 4 months. That's ridiculous.
Yeah,
okay.
That is ridiculous.
SOPs must contain fill-in-the-blank templates. The template has to be in the SOP. That way it's under control. If you put these templates outside, the template will change. People will take things away from it, and the SOP won't have changed. So the template has to be in the SOP. And that's the only way to have uniform, high-quality work produced.
That makes total sense.
So we got to, QA, if you're listening, you got to make it easier on the users. You got to make it so that the SOPs are meaningful to them and that they can change their own SOPs so that it's always exactly what they're doing. It's okay to do something differently tomorrow than you did today, but you have to update the SOP before tomorrow.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we see this a lot. I hear this a lot throughout the industry, that SOPs are either not up to date, or that they're so cumbersome that people don't bother to use them at all. And that is when we see mistakes happen, and the FDA has findings and warning letters and things like that, right? So if there's an easy process, and it sounds like there might be.
There definitely is. It's just a matter of getting QA and the users to learn to work together to say, these documents are for the users, the people who read the SOP and do the work. It's for them. It's not for QA. It's not for some auditor or some inspector. It's for the users. And so we have to write them in a way that makes it easy for them to keep them up to date. And, I see all these people telling me they don't follow the SOP, and then they pull out of their drawer a set of notes and they follow that. And I tell them, just put those notes inside the SOP.
Exactly. No, and that's so true. And we want to be able to have whoever is working, in the department or in the organization, be able to follow along and do the same exact thing. So from one user to the next. So it's important to have those notes. If one person's doing it that way, everybody needs to be doing it that way. If it's the right way.
And this way, when you go on a real vacation, like maybe Disneyland will open and you can go, when you come back, your work hasn't piled up because someone else has done your work the way you would have done it according to the same SOP.
Exactly.
So it's actually to your advantage to make it so that other people can do work for you. Because I'll tell you, I don't want to come back from vacation and have, 5,000 emails and all this work that has just been piling up. I want the other people to do it for me.
And even more, it's critical to the product or the device or whatever that your organization, the quality of the that you're producing as an organization. It's critical.
That's why SOPs are the first part of quality. They make it uniform.
Exactly. Thank you, David. So compliance with 21 CFR Part 11 not only provides higher quality, as we've mentioned, greater security that you mentioned at the beginning, and accurate audit trails, but it can also boost ROI. So, we're all looking for a return on investment. And you have mentioned, the time savings for people who don't have to keep revalidating. Can you talk a little bit more before we close today about the pros and cons here in terms of a return on investment to the organization?
Well, yeah. So we definitely want to use computer systems over paper-based systems. I'm not saying don't use paper. Sometimes it is actually better to use paper. I've had some of my clients that went from paper-based manufacturing, and they introduced iPads.
Yep.
And iPads, you got to get, they have to have batteries. They sometimes get dropped or stolen. They need version upgrades, and they found that it actually was making them go slower. So don't be anti-paper. What you want to be is anti-keeping of paper. If you take a piece of paper and you scan it, you verify the scan, you can get rid of the paper and keep the scan. So let's talk about being productive. Productive doesn't mean you're against paper. You're just against storage. We don't want paper in file cabinets. Software as a service has been touted as this new thing that is supposed to make everything so much better. It's not actually true. It is true that software as a service is about convenience. It does make it more convenient.
Okay.
It's not cheaper. I have never seen it actually be cheaper. And it doesn't change your responsibilities. It doesn't eliminate computer system validation. So you have to really beware of vendor claims. So beware about software as a service. You still have to know the industry standards. You still have to do validation. We, as a society of people, have to get smarter about computers and applications. People tell me that they know how to shop on Amazon and they can watch movies on Netflix. And they say that they're really smart computer people. No, that's a different kind of smart. Validation is knowing, where does the data go when I put it in the computer system? How does it affect another part of my manufacturing process or whatever I'm doing? So it's a lot more intelligent than shopping or watching, TV through the internet. Okay. Today we call people knowledge workers. Knowledge workers are people that take time to seek out the industry standards. Mm-hmm. They learn how to perform computer system validation. They're more valuable employees. They get higher pay. They have more opportunities. And what they do is, instead of running away from validation, instead of running away from, the SOP has to be updated, a lot of smart people run away from things. They're like, I'm going to just work on my work and I'm going to run away from everything else. Instead of running away, say, we can do it a better way. We can do it a more efficient way. We can do it a more modern way. We have the tools. The tools have been out. I keep telling you this. These tools have been out since 2005 timeframe. It's not like they were invented last year. So they've been around a long time.
Sure.
We just got to seek them out, and you've got to start applying them. My clients tell me, they're amazed. They're like, first of all, you actually told us the truth. And the truth is you don't have to work as hard, but you have to be smarter. And and sometimes being smarter kind of scares them. They have to be like, I'm going to make a decision about how this computer system is configured. I'm going to make a decision about the process that we're going to use in our new computer system. That's the kind of opportunities we want our users to have. That makes their job more rewarding for them. So I get these really positive responses. I get people that say they understand better, they've abandoned the old ways, they've come to the new ways, and the corporate culture has changed. They're more efficient. And the thing that they're really trying to deal with now is they're trying to slow down the rate of change. They want the amount of change to slow to the point where their tools for validation, their ability to update SOPs is reasonable. And right. I think if we got together, we could make this change. We could get together and say, vendor, you're giving us too many updates. We want you to give us less frequent updates. We want you to help us to understand what has been changed. If we work together with our vendors and not just think of them as like magicians, they magically make software and it comes and it works great. You have to say, we're going to work with you. We're going to tell you what we need.
Right.
You're going to give us what we think we need. We're going to validate and then give you more feedback. If we do that the way it was intended to work, it actually works better for everyone. I've been having great results working with smaller vendors. Smaller vendors take the time to listen to their users. They're more responsive. They provide better tools. So don't be afraid of small vendors. Take the time to go on the validation vacation and implement these new modern ways. So
no,
I was really happy to do this podcast with you because we just don't have enough places to tell people that there's new and better ways of doing things. And so that's one thing I hope we really did today was tell people, hey, the way you're doing it, if you hate it, try a new way that's faster and better.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think we will work on, together, you and I will work on bringing a webinar out there for folks who are interested in maybe seeing the hands-on, templates and how to use them and getting some real case studies behind it, because those are the high impact things that really make a difference for people when they're contemplating making a change within their organization.
Yeah, I think people are going to love hearing that. It's really good.
I agree. Well, David, we have covered a lot today. And of course, we'll include links in our show notes to some of your slides and to your templates. And I also wanted to mention for our listeners out there who are interested in maybe doing a little bit of research on their own, that you have written 5 books over the last decade or decade and a half. The newest one being Software as a Service, Risk-Based Validation with Time-Saving Templates. So there comes the templates again. And we'll have links.
That's where the templates are.
Yeah, and we'll have links to those books too in the show notes. So listeners will be able to find those easily and make use of them. But in closing, David, are there any final thoughts or strategies you'd like to share with our listeners?
The best way to learn is to do it on something that means something to you. Like if you're working in a laboratory and you have a LIMS system, you want to validate that LIMS system.
Right.
If you're working on a manufacturing line and you use some manufacturing software, you want to validate that manufacturing software. If you validate and you do it this new way that we're talking about, using the fill-in-the-blank templates, and you follow the industry standards, you're going to become a better, more knowledgeable person. Your employer is going to like you better. You're going to have a lot more opportunity if you go somewhere else to go to work. And so I want you to take it as a personal challenge to learn this. Don't wait for some manager to assign you a validation project. Go volunteer for it. It'll really make all the difference.
So true, David. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you to our guest, David Nettleton, Principal of Computer Systems Validation. Also, a big shout out to our producer, Ben Kitchen, and the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. Lastly, a big thank you to you, our valued listeners. We love having you here with us every week. If you have topic requests or guest suggestions, we'd love to hear from you on that. If you enjoyed this episode, we ask you to subscribe in your podcast player of choice and share it with your friends and colleagues and online networks. We really appreciate that. For today's show notes and information on this podcast, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com. We'll be back again next week with another great interview. Until then, stay healthy and safe.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.